We were dealing with the church of my adulthood with John the 23rd coming in. And so we'll continue on at that point in the impact of the reign of Pope John the 23rd. Let's begin with a prayer. Father, we ask your blessing, your care, and your healing on the people who were involved in the terrible accident in California today. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the healer. Amen. So, radio and TV began to carry a lot of images of a kindly old man who had become known as Good Pope John. Everyone took him to their hearts. He had sort of a grandfatherly feel to him, and he was concerned and in love with his grandchildren. It was almost as though, and you see this is, I consider Pope Francis today to be practically a clone of John the 23rd. But John the 23rd was not judgmental. He wanted to see people live better lives and everything, but he was much more interested in helping you or guiding you to that than in condemning anything you were doing. He was the kind of man who was an elderly grandfather, actually. He broke the papal mold by continuing to do the things he did as a priest. Normally, and this is another thing about Pope Francis, when Francis became Pope, there's a set building in which the cardinals stayed, and they were taken into the voting and stayed there. But when he left, he went down and paid for his room. The Pope would never do that. A limo pulled up for him, and he skipped the limo and got on the bus with the rest of the cardinals. It's just he did not change because he became Pope. John the 23rd did not. He continued to visit prisons. He mingled with people in the streets. He anointed the sick. And if the rumors are true, and I suspect they are, he used to go out in disguise so he could walk around the city of Rome like a normal person. Many people, both in and out of the Catholic Church, noticed the Catholic Church had a very serious problem. We were a proud and an ancient tradition, and absolutely the oldest in the world. I may have mentioned this one time before because I think it's very interesting that there's an atheistic professor who deals in economics. And when he does the first lecture in economics, part of it is, he said, you cannot look at economics and try and figure out how economics works in the world if you're ignorant of the oldest continual institution in the entire world, the largest institution in the entire. He goes through a whole bunch of things, and you think he's talking about AT&T or something, but he's talking about the Catholic Church. He says it's the oldest continuous leadership, over 2,000 years. They've had leaders to this group. And so the thing is, the church ends up crystallized, actually. This unique position of the church caused it to look very much at the glories of its tradition and was allowing it to grow out of touch with the modern world, okay? So, like for instance, if you look at the church today, it's amazing how many people who are saints canonized today, who died during my lifetime, whom we all knew about during their lifetime. Like for instance, if you were to go into the church at that time, when they would talk about poverty, they would talk about St. Francis, who certainly is a great evidence of poverty. But in my day, we talked about Mother Teresa, who was alive in India while they were talking about her and living that kind of life. When you talked about a life of great devotion, you could go to Teresa of Avila or Teresa of Lisieux, people, from the history of the church. Or when I was a youngster, they talked about Padre Pio, who was a priest in Italy, who was just a remarkable man with regards to holiness, personal holiness. And so the the glory of the church, the wonder of the church, causes us oftentimes to look back, okay? And actually, we need to understand that the holiness and the greatness of the church is what the church is today and what it will be tomorrow. And that's what we're a part of and working on. As far as the greatness, that we can celebrate that when we get to heaven. We need to preserve and build this greatness. So the question was, how could it continue to minister to the world, which was undergoing radical and very speedy change? And perhaps, would it even survive? I think one of my favorite quotes comes from a gentleman who was, I don't think he was a priest, but he was a professor in a Catholic university, and he was somewhere in the Midwest. And remember when we talked about Garibaldi taking over Italy to unite the country? He had to conquer the Papal States. When he did that, the Pope went inside the Vatican and became like a prisoner of the Vatican. He wouldn't recognize the fact Italy existed or anything like this. I think it was Pius IX. And when Pius IX died, the headline in the New York Times was, "The last Pope of history dies." And they said, because they thought, like he'd closed in on himself as the institution, and that it would just be over with him, and that was the whole thing. And this professor in the university wrote an article, and I think the article originally was a letter to the editor of the New York Times, but it ultimately became something on its own. But the first line of it was, "Every generation writes the obituary of the Catholic Church, only to find their children worshiping within its walls." And that's true. Like we look at things going on, the church becoming obsolete, the church reforming too fast. We see all kinds of things that to all of us appear to be a danger. But we misunderstand the size of the church. We misunderstand the guidance of the church. We misunderstand how the church is able to use her own history. It's hard to see. We have survived when a church became so out of touch historically that it was like a joke. We survived it. We have survived times when the church was the cutting edge of everything, and they were way ahead of everything, like Leo XIII, with regards to organizing labor and all this sort of stuff that really wasn't going on. They thought he was a radical, crazy man. But the church has survived things like this all the way around. So, Pope John began to deal with this at the very beginning by addressing two encyclicals. And incidentally, encyclicals, which are the Pope's statement of views on things, would always be written to my brother bishops. And it would be important for the bishops in the world to read the encyclical of the Pope about whatever it's on, like one of the ones of Francis was on climate change. But they would be on all kinds of things, and you needed to know this was the Pope's position on it. Now, this isn't the church position as such, but it is the Pope's position. And then if enough bishops in the world gathered, it becomes actually the church position. So the letters would be addressed to these. John the 23rd didn't. He wrote his encyclicals, and he wrote it to all people of goodwill. It wasn't just to bishops. It wasn't to priests and bishops. It wasn't to Catholics, priests, and bishops. It was to every person in the world of goodwill. And he invited the church to open its heart to the world by opening the windows to humanity. Now, what did he mean to the windows to humanity? This remembrance of the church, of the greatness of the church. If anyone's ever been to Rome, you can do that. You can sit in St. Peter's Basilica, and you can look at these monuments to all the wonderful people in the history going around and all this sort of thing. And it's very easy to look back and all this sort of thing. But what John the 23rd says, open the windows and see what's going on outside. see what the world has to offer us. And so that's what he really brought about. He sought to bring the church to an openness he had to everybody, and the popularity that engenders this, he decided to bring this about. He decided to call an ecumenical council. And you see, we saw John the 23rd, this old, elderly man who came as kind of a grandfather and was immediately loved by everyone. I mean, I was in an ecumenical seminary where we had all different denominations. They all thought John the 23rd was the greatest thing on the face of the earth. As a religious leader, he was just insanely popular. So what does John want to do? He wants to do the same thing to the church. He said the Roman Catholic Church, with our history, we should be the elderly grandfather. And as an elderly grandfather, we should be interested in everyone advancing and doing good. The advantage of an elderly grandfather doesn't use a lot of judgment on things that are going on, tries to help people, tries to change people, but has behind him the experience of a lifetime. And that's why, in Native American culture, children are not raised by parents, they're raised by their grandparents. And because they have the wisdom of more experience and that sort of thing. And I think most families I know, the grandparents are preferred to the parents all the time, but the grandparents don't have to discipline you. They aren't judgmental. They help. It's an amazing thing, the role of a grandparent. He says the Catholic Church, as a community, we could have that position to the whole world. It's a matter of how we go about it. So he called an ecumenical council. One of the favorite stories of people, John the 23rd, as we mentioned, is a great pastor, not a great theologian. That wasn't his forte. But John the 23rd decided he was going to call an ecumenical council. There hadn't been an ecumenical council for a long time. And after, I think, the First Vatican Council declared the Pope infallible. So after the First Vatican Council, they said, if the Pope's infallible, why do you have to have a council anyway? All he has to do is declare something. And John the 23rd didn't want to do that. For him, a council was where you got everyone's views. And John the 23rd held that you'll know what God wants by listening to God's people, all of them. We all have divergent views and everything, but it's the Pope's job to gather that because God speaks through the church. Remember, one of the things that Jesus said about the church, he said, he who hears you hears me. And so if one listens to the church, and by the church I mean the individuals in the church, you listen to the church, you will hear the voice of God. And that's exactly what the Pope wanted to do. So he called an ecumenical council. Once he called the council, he realized that he had started something he didn't understand. It would be like me deciding, we need a new government. Okay, what do I know about a government? I don't fully understand how you get to be a senator or how the votes work and the different things, or what one votes on and what Congress votes on and what the Senate votes on. I don't understand all those things because it's just not a big study to me. But if I were to decide to organize a government, I'm absolutely unprepared to do that. Even in theory, I couldn't do it, And John the 23rd phoned the most ecumenical of the cardinals at the time. He was Cardinal Sunens. And I think Sunens, he might have been in the Netherlands. I'm not quite sure where he was. But anyway, he phoned Cardinal Sunens. And the question he asked him, it was announced internationally, he'd called an ecumenical council. And the question he asked Cardinal Sunens is, what's an ecumenical council? And he said, I felt under an inspiration of the Spirit to call it, and now I need. And Sunens largely helped organize the whole thing. And John announced, as he departed for the conclave that would elect him, that the church is young. He says the church needed to learn more about the world in which the church lived. He says, so the church is young. And the church is young in the world in which we're living, because the world in which we're living is advancing faster than we are. So we are the youth in the world at this particular time. And he said the church needed an inner renewal. So he called the council in 1959, and I should tell you that is the very year I entered the seminary. 1959, I entered the seminary as he called the council. The opening ceremonies for the council were televised over the entire world. And even now, as I remember that day in the seminary watching TV, it is unbelievably emotional to me. I was, just in my very first year in the seminary, a child, really. I just graduated from high school. And you're looking at what you're part of. There was a procession that entered St. Peter's Basilica, and there were 2,540 bishops. And this procession went on endlessly. And there were black bishops and Chinese bishops and Japanese bishops, French bishops, the bishops from the islands, everywhere. The whole world was represented as it came in to St. Peter's Basilica. I had no idea of what the church that I was going to serve really was until that day. And it hit me. We have a history that reaches back further than anyone. We have a future that is unbelievable, and we are spread everywhere in the world, everywhere in the entire world. We are spread. So many bishops, so many nationalities, so many different liturgical garments. Like I'd never seen a bishop wear anything than what I knew a bishop to wear. Bishops wear different things in different countries. The same country, color, this red, but very different robes, and I cannot even describe what that procession was like. It was impossible not to recognize this as a meeting of the entire world. You could see it as a meeting of the entire world. Something that went on previous to the council was John was very liberal, and the head of the Holy Office, which is the people in charge of doctrine in the church, tend to be normally conservative, but that one was extremely conservative. His name was Cardinal Octaviani. And I may have mentioned in the last talk, I don't remember, there was a conflict between Octaviani and the Pope. And because Octaviani is in charge of, among other things, liturgy, Octaviani wrote a letter. And in the letter, he said that no part of the Eucharistic prayer, that Latin prayer, he said no part of that prayer could be changed. And I was thinking, none of us wanted to see it changed. We just wanted to see it translated in English. But we didn't want to see it changed at all, that I knew of. And then John the 23rd wrote a letter the very next day, and he changed the Eucharistic prayer. He inserted the name of Saint Joseph, where it says, Blessed Virgin Mary, her blessed spouse Joseph, and goes on like that. And so he just inserted it. And it struck me, John the 23rd was a great liberal. Well, how liberal is St. Joseph? I mean, that's about as conservative as you can get. But what was going on is, in the Roman Catholic Church, the center of the church is our altar. And if you want to change something in the church, you need to be in charge of the altar. Octaviani, when he said you can't change anything there, tried to take control of the altar. And when John the 23rd added just 3 words to that Eucharistic prayer, he took back control of the altar. And that's why Vatican II ended up being so successful, because of that little exchange that seemed to me ridiculous in the seminary, watching that exchange at the beginning of the council. It just seemed as nothing. So John called the bishops to recognize all the changes that had taken place in the world, okay? Now, the thing is, how could you not recognize the changes? Well, just take the area of paleontology. Paleontology had really watched evolution through bones and all this sort of thing. Everyone in the field of paleontology could map out, let me just take one, you can map out a wolf and see how you get down to a teacup poodle from that. You can map out from a wolf and figure out how you end up with a dachshund and a Great Dane. They're all descended from the wolf. But you do it by watching their bones over a period of time and studying them. And they could see all these changes and everything in the animals, discovering certain kinds of animals actually broke off from other animals. And you watch this and this sort of thing. A lot of it began with Darwin in the Galapagos Islands, but you can really see it amazingly in the world. And so he says, look at what's going on in the world. Paleontology is a fact in the world. He says, a lot of bishops said, well, this, no. He says, no. Look at the world and recognize the facts. I think one of the really interesting things is to work in a hospital for a while. I worked at Summers at Mercy Hospital in San Diego, and you begin to learn, like for instance, if you have a patient come in, the patient's all bloody, and so you clean up the blood because you have to get the blood cleaned up to find out what's wrong underneath. Okay, and then you're working on. I wasn't working, but the doctor would be working on cuts and this sort of thing. But the doctor is really alert to the fact that, for instance, this patient might actually be diabetic. Now, there's no signs of diabetes on the body, but that has a big effect on what medications you use and how you use them. This patient may have heart problems. And you may look at them and say, what we need to do is get them into surgery and repair their arm. And the thing is, can this person survive anesthesia and stuff in surgery? It just becomes a very complicated thing. You can see what needs to be done, but you need to know how to do it to this person. It isn't a textbook case of repairing an arm or something. And so John is saying, this is true too. We can see what we would like in the world. We can see what we would like the church to be. We can see the changes we want. But first find out where the world is, what the world is. He said that the council's work was not to condemn errors and not to condemn people who taught them, but to discover ways in which the traditions of the church could be clarified so that people could better understand the truth and learn to live the truths in unity. Okay? So another approach, if you look at the council, Second Vatican Council was the first council in our history that didn't end with a series of condemnations. You know, what we recognize as the very first council in the Roman Catholic Church is the Council of Jerusalem. It appears in the Acts of the Apostles. And they decide that they're going to let Gentiles come into the church. Before that, there was a question about whether just Jews could come in. So they decide to let Gentiles in. But the listing closes with condemnation. They cannot eat meat with blood in it. They, I forget what, but anyway, there's a series of condemnations. You need to do this, this, this. And this Vatican Council did not do any of that at all. And what he believed is, he said, the difficulty is not that the world is insincere or doesn't want to be good or doesn't want to be happy or doesn't want to be doing. The difficulty is the church does not understand the teachings of the church. And what we need to do is to begin to make the teachings of the church available to people. And what would be the very first thing of that? Put the liturgy in the language of the people. That's what we discovered. You know, as a little boy, when I first went to Mass, the gospel, the epistle, were all read in Latin. And so the priest would give a homily, and we would understand the homily, this sort of thing, but we had no idea it related to the Bible in any way. We didn't understand that. Then they moved the readings into English, so that the epistle and the gospel were in English. So then we at least knew that in relationship to the homily. But we didn't know the prayers that were being said at the altar. And so this idea is we need to make sure people understand. One of the basic truths here, in order, and this is an absolute plank in my mind, people, if they understand and have the freedom, will always choose what's best. The difficulty is, oftentimes, they do not understand it. And the other thing is, oftentimes, they don't have the freedom to choose it. You know, an example about the understanding would be smoking. When I was a little boy, everyone smoked. And it was a non-thing. No one would say anything about someone smoking. But there was a group of people who realized the problems with it, which is the Tuberculosis Association. So the Tuberculosis Association began to work on smoking. And what did they essentially do? Essentially, they let people know what smoking does. When, for the first long period of time, they showed what smoking does to the smoker. Now we even know what smoking does to the children of a smoker, even after the smoker has stopped smoking, with what they've done to their body, what that does to their generation of children. We know so much about it now. And, you know, I live in a town, San Luis Obispo. It's against the law to smoke here. You can be cited for smoking on the streets, and the only way you could really smoke is if you are in your own house. But there's a caveat. If you have any child in that house under the age of 18 who reports you, you'll be in trouble still. Okay? And it's to protect people. And everyone recognizes now the thing. But how did we do that? You educate people. You can educate people to change if the change is good for them. You can actually educate people to change. Takes a long time, but it ends up a real change. Okay? Like, for instance, in San Luis with the thing of smoking, there are no federal laws against smoking. None of the big laws came down here. It's just the community decided we do not want smoking here. So anyway, much time was spent just before and at the beginning of the Council of the Bishops getting to know one another. The council was very slow in starting, but Cardinal Soenens of Belgium suggested the bishops study the Church not in itself, but in its relationship to the world, and to do this in dialogue with other Christians and the secular world. So he says, we want to look at the Church not just as the Church. What we want to do is see the Church in the world, and not just from Catholics. We want to know, like today, if a man is being considered to be appointed a bishop, they send out letters to certain people who might know him to give an analysis of the man, and they give you specific questions. You know, one of the questions that's on the paper is, how is this man viewed by non-Catholics? How does this man relate to clergy of other Christian denominations? Those two questions are why? Because we need to see how the Church is in the world, not just how the Church is itself, it's in the world. One of the fascinating things for me personally was in studying art at Berkeley. The study of art, there's so many things you can learn, but an example would be if the wall behind me were red, if it were a red wall, do you know if you put up a red sign there, you wouldn't see it. If you put up the red sign on the white wall, everyone sees it. Okay? So it's not just the sign, it's where it is. Now, if this back wall behind me, let's say, is purple, if I put up a blue banner, that wall is going to look pretty red. If I put up a red banner, it's going to look pretty blue in contrast. So what you want to do is learn not just what the church is, but how it is set in the world. Because the church, in fact, is set in the world. The bishops endorsed this approach, and Pope John approved it. So this was Cardinal Sunans. And again, Cardinal Sunans had forget his name now. Cardinal Sunans and another theologian really had a big impact on the organization of the council. The council could have taken the direction of studying the church in itself, okay? But it went out to study the view in the world. Shortly after the end of the first session, although none of the documents were written down, the bishops went home with the promise that they would be called back. And this idea of the promise they would be called back, I shouldn't say often, there have been councils in the church where the bishops have not been finished their work, have been sent home, and the Vatican did the work then from the stuff, rather than have them come back and do it. This wasn't to be the thing. They were promised they would be called back. But before he could convene the second session, John the 23rd died, okay? But he'd set it up under his spirit. It had been all put together. And it's very interesting that the next man elected was considered the most liberal of all the bishops at the council. And he is the man that Pope Pius XII had groomed to be pope. Forget his actual name, but his name is Paul VI as pope. But he's the man Pius XII had groomed in the way Pius XII was pope and everything. And they decided to elect John the 23rd. What was amazing to me, the personality of Pius XII was very authoritarian and everything. Personality of John the 23rd came up from the bottom and is very pastoral. But this man who had been trained by Pius XII bought in entirely to John the 23rd's thing, and miraculously, all the bishops, the cardinals rather, backed him. Now you have to understand, these are very elderly men, and they backed this man that represents the new wave. And I think what really did it was so insanely popular John the 23rd was. You imagine what the church could do in the world that popular. You're seeing some of that now because of the popularity of Francis. But if you can make the institution as popular as that, then the amount to be accomplished is actually amazing. In 1963, Paul VI was elected pope. He had the reputation of being the most liberal of all the bishops. And as I mentioned, he was the man Pius XII prepared for office. As a bishop through his life, the great concern of his life were always students and social problems, okay? And Pius XII was very interested in those things. He believed the future rested in the hands of students, which is a simple thing I think most of us would recognize. And he was very interested in the social problems because they're the major problems plaguing the world today. They're heavy social problems. Paul VI quickly made clear his intention of continuing the council, and because of his training in the diplomatic corps, he was uniquely equipped to deal with the many conflicts that were arising in the council. Now, John the 23rd inspired them. They came up and they had all these ideas fomenting, and as the ideas began to foment, they were breaking into camps as this, but to me, it's a miracle of God that John the 23rd did not get to finish the council. I think it would have been so hopelessly divided. But Paul VI, a diplomat, was a man of compromise. And so he was able to come in and get these people to make slight changes so that they adjusted to one another. He was a man of vision and compromise. He made clear the objectives of the council to define and renew the church. So the first thing we wanted to do is to define the church in the world and renew it in regard to the world. So that was the first thing. The second thing was to promote unity among Christians. They were very interested in the reunion of Christians. And what's fascinating to me is that when they came into the council, the interest in reunion in the day of John the 23rd was basically with the Orthodox churches. By the end of the first council, the interest was with Protestant churches as well as the Orthodox. And if you look at the church today, there's an interest in finding a level of union with the Muslims, the Buddhists, the Hindus, everything. But once you, I oftentimes like to think of ideas if you're a bowler. I'm not a bowler, but I like the image that if you, once you start a bowling ball, I presume a really good bowler has a good idea of where it's going, but I don't, okay? So I take my best shot aiming at what I want, okay? And I throw the ball, but then I have to stop and watch the ball go and go and go. And oftentimes it knocks down pins that I wasn't aiming at. Oftentimes it goes between pins, hitting neither one that I was after. But the whole idea is that once you postulate ideas, ideas move. Like you can't own an idea. And so when they started this idea of reunion, when they started this idea of recognizing, drawing things together, we aren't finished with that yet. That idea grows and grows and grows. And the other thing, what was most important to him personally, to Paul VI, was to enter into a dialogue with the modern world. Now, what does this mean to enter a dialogue? It means we're examining where the church is in the world and everything. We're allowing non-believers, non-Catholics and non-believers to challenge us as to what the church should be. At the same time, we challenge them as to what the world should be. And so a dialogue is instituted, and this dialogue helps the church to better belong in the world. It helps the world to pick up good ideas from the church without joining the church to get the ideas. It's a way of building both sides. To this end, he permitted members of the press to be present for the assembly's debates and gave frequent interviews. So never before had there been a non-bishop and an ecumenical council. Now there were members of different denominations, and he allowed the press to come in and film it. And if you know, we like to think that the Catholic Church sort of stands as a kind of monolithic thing, but at the council you didn't see that. You saw people arguing over this and that and the other thing. It was wonderful. And again, it was all translated because many of the bishops did not speak other languages. The official language of the council, of course, was Latin, but you had at your seat as a bishop, I think there were 20 languages. And you just put on the earphone and hit the language you want, and you heard it. So news services had access to that too. And so you could get the things right as they were going on. And this is the important thing. Also, the other thing is he gave interviews. The popes before that time would make statements on TV, but wouldn't make interviews. You still don't see a lot of interviews. You saw interviews with John the 23rd. You saw, you saw interviews with Paul VI, and then John Paul got even more into it. although during the end of his life, he wasn't physically able to do that, so it sort of ended. And it's begun again with Francis, these sort of freewheeling interviews. Before John the 23rd, that never occurred, because you wouldn't want to get, like for instance with Francis, you wouldn't want to get an embarrassing question like, what do you think about gays, or what do you think about gay priests, or something like that. You don't want a question like that. But today the popes deal with that. That's the way the world works. The most far-reaching of results of the council were in areas where the church had been in discussion and study for a long time. And to realize that while these things were brought before all the bishops, there was a group of bishops that had been studying paleontology as a group. There had been groups of bishops that have been studying unions for a long time. There was a small group of bishops whose job was to study the Eastern Orthodox churches, and there were groups that dealt with the Protestants. So they were all, but what it did, it forced all the bishops to work at these things. The first thing is the liturgy. The liturgy was hugely impacted. Liturgy is the prayer that takes place on the altar. The public prayer of the church is called liturgy. And it was greatly impacted by a very long liturgical movement. And the main thing they were looking for was they were calling for active, conscious participation by the people. So when I was a little boy, everything was in Latin. Liturgy was definitely a spectator sport. You sat in the pew, received communion, Mass ended, and you went out. Okay, and so that's basically the way it was conducted. And I will speak just for myself personally. When I was a little boy and raised, I hated going to church. And if I messed up in church, which I did a few times, my father would take me to the next Mass again. And I soon learned that it was easier to be quiet during one Mass than to try and be quiet during two. So where it changed for me was the day I made First Communion. The day I made First Communion, I began to come up and could receive communion. I couldn't receive communion before then. But I figured out that what changed was not just the making First Communion, but as soon as you made First Communion, you were in second grade. As soon as you made First Communion, you could begin to serve Mass on the altar. And it's serving Mass on the altar that changed it for me. Because then you aren't just sitting waiting for something to happen. You have things to do, you had books to move, you had things to... And you find the greatest participation in the liturgy brings the most loyalty, and the most people get out of the liturgy. People who read, people who distribute communion, people who are in the choir, people do... These are the things that build the involvement, because the church was never intended to be a spectator sport. Never intended. And now that it's in English, that we try our best to get people involved, but to get people involved is to make them fully part of the church. And so that was one of the major things we wanted to see done. And a little bit about the liturgical movement. The liturgical movement began in Germany in a monastery called Maria Loch, Our Lady of the Lake, and Mary of the Lake, rather. And in this particular monastery, when the Nazis took over, they forbid priests from monasteries to go out and work in parishes. And so these people had been studying how liturgy was celebrated in the very early church. And so they asked the Pope if they could start celebrating liturgy according to these very early liturgical things. And the Pope said yes, because there's no one else to see it, so you can experiment with these things. But just to tell you a couple things, the shortest Eucharistic prayer we have today was written by a man called Hippolytus. It comes from the very early church. And it's actually the oldest liturgy for the altar that we have in the Catholic Church. And it wasn't the one that was being used in the Latin. It wasn't used at all. So now that's the shortest one. We have that. But there are about, I think, maybe 9, 10, maybe 12 of these Eucharistic prayers that we can use now. And so we have these kind of variants. Vestments were very different in the early church than they were when I was a youngster. And so much of the church has been changed with regards to this. But in Maria Locke, they'd been experimenting with this all along. So as soon as they began to talk about it, like people would say, wouldn't it be nice if the community could receive from the cup? And they would say, no, you can't do that. And the church did it all over in the early church. So these people who had been experimenting with the early church says, we know how to do it. We've been doing it in the monastery as we celebrate this. So the liturgy was greatly impacted by that. The council demanded the liturgy be in local languages, greater attention to the scriptures, and clear and informative homilies. The church wanted more attention to the Bible, and that's throughout the church, not just in the services, but throughout the church, more attention to the Bible. Just to tell you, when I was studying in the seminary in San Diego, we had books by the big theologians, everything in Latin, all that sort of stuff. When I entered the seminary in Ottawa in Canada, the only book you could carry into the classroom was a Bible. Now, they were teaching all the theologians, but they showed how they got it out of the Bible. And that was so you could get up and preach, so you would know what the text meant and could do it. Bishops were to be in charge of making the changes. The priests were supposed to face the people and called for the revision of the sacramental rites. Liturgical changes were certainly the most visible changes after Vatican II. And we will watch that the teachings of Vatican II will be called through the liturgies into the community. But when I was a youngster, the homilies, you very seldom heard an interesting homily. The only man who gave interesting homilies when I was a youngster simultaneously taught history at the University of San Diego, and he came and supplied my parish in Sundays. And he was fascinating because he brought in elements from history and stuff like that. So I enjoyed listening to him. But with the council, they want people to be interested in homilies. And I find personally the worst aspect of the Roman Catholic Church is homilies. It is the worst aspect of the church. And so often when a homily is finished, I have the feeling the priest didn't say anything. You know, he talked, but he hasn't said anything. And so this was one of the major things the church was about. And I think if people don't become more aware of that, we're going to pay a price for that in the church, because there are a lot of Protestants who are great preachers. You can go into a Protestant church and listen to a guy for an hour and a half, you know? And a huge number of Catholics, particularly Catholics, who would preach about a half an hour. You've had it. It's just, we have to learn preaching. But anyway, that was one of the major things of the Vatican Council. So we'll call it there now and pick it up there next week. As far as where we would go from here, the two major suggestions we had is that they go through kind of a history of the liturgy, and that would be a history of church designs as well as a history of the garment changes and stuff in the liturgy. That was one of the things. The other called to go somewhere in the scriptures, to go back to the scriptures. So again, I don't know whether, I don't know how Michael asked you to communicate with him, so I'm not going to say. But anyway, if you're interested in something in particular, let us know. We'll try and accommodate you. Thank you very much.